Leo Kingston had spent his life closing deals, crushing competitors, and controlling every outcome. But none of his billions, none of his power, had prepared him for the moment a 6-year-old girl with dark curls and striking blue eyes tugged at his sleeve by the pool of his luxury hotel and whispered, "Please, mister, help me. My mom won't wake up." At first, he thought she had mistaken him for someone else. But as he followed her through the marble hallways, past the indulgent guests who had no idea their world was about to shift, Leo felt something unsettling crawl up his spine. And when he stepped into that dimly lit hotel room and saw the unconscious woman on the bed, his entire past came rushing back. Because he knew her. And the little girl clutching a battered stuffed rabbit? She had his eyes. Leo Kingston sat by the infinity pool of the exclusive hotel, his dark hair slightly tousled by the warm Monaco breeze. His glass of whiskey rested on the small side table next to him, untouched. The world around him was perfect: crystal clear water, waiters in crisp uniforms, and the quiet murmur of wealthy guests enjoying their private retreats. He had everything a man could ever want, yet an unfamiliar emptiness sat deep within his chest. He had spent years building his empire, turning his sharp instincts into a billion-dollar investment firm that controlled markets and toppled competitors. But success had come at a price. He had no real attachments, no family waiting for him anywhere, no one to share his achievements with. Relationships, when they happened, were transactional at best. His entire life was about control, of his business, his time, and his emotions. But for the first time in years, sitting under the golden afternoon sun, he felt like he had lost control of something, though he couldn't name what. As he exhaled slowly, letting his gaze drift over the edge of the pool, a small shadow moved in the corner of his vision. He turned his head slightly, expecting to see a waiter or perhaps one of the hotel staff, but instead, a little girl stood a few feet away from him. She had dark, curly hair that framed her delicate face, and her enormous blue eyes locked onto his with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. There was fear there, but also determination. In her small hands, she clutched a worn-out stuffed rabbit, its fur faded from years of love. Leo frowned. Children weren't common in places like this, not without their wealthy parents hovering nearby. He scanned the area, expecting to see a nanny or a distracted mother on the phone, but the girl was alone. Something about her was strangely familiar, but he couldn't place it. Before he could say anything, she stepped closer, her little fingers tightening around the rabbit. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but the urgency in it was unmistakable. "Sir, please, help me." Leo sat up, his instincts immediately sharpening. He wasn't the kind of man who got involved in other people's problems, but there was something in the way she looked at him that made it impossible to ignore. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice steady but softer than usual. She swallowed hard, her eyes darting toward the hotel. "My mom, she won't wake up." For a moment, Leo didn't move. The words sank in, and a strange sensation gripped him, something between dread and protectiveness. He had dealt with high-stakes negotiations, ruthless corporate takeovers, and financial crises that made others crumble. But a little girl asking for help in a desperate whisper. That was entirely foreign to him. He stood up without thinking, already moving before his mind could question why. "Where is she?" The girl turned quickly and began to run toward the hotel. Leo followed without hesitation. Leo followed the little girl through the hotel's grand hallway, his polished shoes tapping against the marble floor as she hurried ahead, gripping her stuffed rabbit tightly. The guests around them barely took notice, sipping their champagne or lounging in luxury, oblivious to the urgency of the moment. The girl glanced over her shoulder once to make sure he was still there, then continued running down the corridor. Her small frame moved with surprising determination, as if she knew she had no time to waste. They reached an elevator, but instead of waiting, she turned and ran toward the stairs. Leo hesitated for only a second before following. She was moving quickly for someone with such short legs, her bare feet barely making a sound against the cool marble steps. He was used to moving fast, to making decisions in seconds that changed the course of industries, but there was something unnerving about following a frightened child up the winding staircase, unsure of what he was about to walk into. By the time they reached the third floor, she was slightly out of breath, but she didn't slow down. She ran straight to the end of the hallway, stopping in front of a door marked 312. The door was slightly ajar. Leo reached her just as she hesitated on the threshold, pressing her small body against the doorframe. She turned her head and looked up at him, her blue eyes wide with worry. For the first time, her confidence wavered. She clutched her rabbit closer and whispered, "She's inside." Leo gently pushed the door open, stepping into the dimly lit hotel room. The heavy curtains were drawn, casting long shadows across the bed. The air inside was thick, carrying the scent of salt from the nearby ocean mixed with something faintly medicinal. A bedside lamp was still on, its weak glow illuminating the still figure lying on the mattress. A young woman lay motionless on the bed, her dark hair fanned out against the pillow, her breathing barely visible. Her skin was pale, and the rise and fall of her chest was so faint that, for a terrible moment, Leo thought she might already be gone. He stepped closer, his sharp gaze scanning the scene. On the nightstand beside the bed, an open bottle of pills lay on its side, some of the tablets spilled onto the glass surface. His stomach tightened as realization struck him. He knelt beside the bed and carefully touched the woman's wrist, searching for a pulse. The beat was weak but still there. He exhaled, feeling an unexpected wave of relief. "She's alive," he said, more to himself than to the girl. The child had crept up beside him, staring at the woman with wide, unblinking eyes. She knelt on the floor next to the bed, placing her rabbit beside her mother's hand as if the toy could somehow bring her back. Leo pulled out his phone and dialed emergency services. The call connected immediately, and he relayed the situation with his usual efficiency, giving the room number and explaining what he suspected, an overdose. The operator assured him an ambulance would arrive within minutes. As he ended the call, he turned to the girl, who had not moved from her spot. She was still staring at her mother, her tiny fingers wrapped around the woman's limp hand. "What's your name?" Leo asked gently. "Sophie," she murmured without looking at him. He glanced at the woman on the bed. He had no idea who she was or how she had ended up like this. But there was one thing he did know: Sophie had come to him for help. And for reasons he couldn't yet understand, he wasn't going to walk away. The paramedics arrived quickly, their movements efficient and precise as they assessed the unconscious woman on the bed. Leo stepped back, watching as they checked her vitals, inserted N4, and prepared her for transport. Sophie didn't move from her spot beside the bed, clutching her stuffed rabbit so tightly that her knuckles turned white. One of the paramedics, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, crouched down to Sophie's level. "Sweetheart, we're going to take your mom to the hospital so the doctors can help her, okay?" she said softly. Sophie didn't respond, just nodded once, her grip on the rabbit tightening. The paramedic glanced up at Leo, silently asking if he was with the girl. "I'll take her," Leo said without hesitation, though the words surprised even him. Sophie looked up at him for the first time since the paramedics arrived. Her blue eyes were full of uncertainty, as if she wasn't sure she could trust him yet. But something in her gaze told him she wanted to. The medics lifted her mother onto the stretcher, securing the straps before wheeling her out of the room. Leo followed, placing a steadying hand on Sophie's shoulder as they moved through the hallway, past the curious stares of hotel guests who had emerged from their rooms. By the time they reached the ambulance, Sophie hesitated, looking between the paramedics and Leo. "Can I go with her?" she asked, her voice small. The paramedic hesitated. "We usually only allow immediate family in the ambulance, sweetheart." Leo stepped forward. "She's just a child," he said, his voice firm but controlled. "She needs to be with her mother." The paramedic looked between him and Sophie, then sighed. "All right, she can ride up front." Leo watched as they helped Sophie into the passenger seat. He had no idea why he was still standing there, why he hadn't simply turned and walked away once the emergency was under control. But as the ambulance doors shut and the siren blared to life, he knew there was no way he was leaving this unfinished. He pulled out his phone, called his driver, and within minutes, his black Mercedes pulled up to the curb. He slid into the back seat and gave the driver the name of the hospital. As they drove, he found himself staring out the window, his mind racing. Something about this girl unsettled him. It wasn't just the situation, it was her. The way she had looked at him by the pool, the way she had chosen him to ask for help when there were dozens of other people around. And those eyes. They reminded him of something, or someone, but he couldn't quite place it. 15 minutes later, he arrived at the hospital. The waiting room was brightly lit, but it carried the heavy air of anxiety, filled with the soft murmurs of worried families and the beeping of distant machines. He spotted Sophie sitting in one of the chairs, her rabbit in her lap. Her small frame looked even smaller under the harsh fluorescent lights. He walked over and sat down next to her. She didn't look at him immediately, just kept staring at the rabbit in her hands. "They said she's sleeping," she whispered. "They don't know when she'll wake up." Leo nodded, unsure of what to say. He wasn't used to comforting people. He dealt in numbers, logic, and control. This was completely out of his element. Sophie finally turned her head to look at him, studying him with those unsettlingly familiar blue eyes. "Why did you help us?" she asked. The question caught him off guard. He should have had a simple answer, because it was the right thing to do, because he had been the closest person around, because walking away wasn't an option when a child was involved. But none of those reasons felt entirely true. "I don't know," he admitted. She tilted her head slightly, as if trying to decide whether to believe him. "Do you know my mom?" she asked next. Leo opened his mouth, about to say no, but then something in his mind clicked. A memory, buried deep, trying to surface. A name, a face, a past he hadn't thought about in years. He turned his gaze toward the closed hospital doors where the doctors were treating Sophie's mother. And suddenly, he wasn't so sure of his answer anymore. Leo sat in the hospital waiting room, his mind a tangled mess of thoughts. He had spent years building a life of certainty, of calculated risks and strategic decisions, but nothing about this situation was predictable. He had come to this hotel to escape, if only for a few days, from the constant pressure of running a billion-dollar empire. And now, somehow, he found himself sitting beside a 6-year-old girl with eyes so eerily familiar that they made his stomach tighten. Sophie hadn't said much since they had arrived. She sat in the chair next to him, hugging her stuffed rabbit to her chest, her small fingers gripping its worn ears. Every now and then, she would steal a glance at him, as if trying to piece together why he was still here, why he hadn't simply left like any other stranger would have. Leo wasn't sure why either. A nurse finally emerged from the restricted area, her expression neutral but professional. She approached them, clipboard in hand. "Are you family?" she asked, looking at Leo. He hesitated. The answer was supposed to be no. He had no connection to this woman. Or at least, that was what he had thought. But now, with the weight of the little girl's eyes on him, with the sharp pull of something deep inside his chest, he wasn't sure of anything. He stopped himself. What was he even about to say? The nurse shifted her gaze to Sophie. "Your mom is stable, sweetheart. She's resting now, but she's very weak. We're going to keep her under observation for the next 24 hours. Sophie nodded but didn't say anything. She only clutched her rabbit tighter. Leo cleared his throat. "Can we see her?" The nurse hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "She's still unconscious, but you can sit with her." She gestured for them to follow. Leo placed a hand on Sophie's shoulder, guiding her gently as they walked through the brightly lit corridor. The steady beeping of heart monitors filled the air, mingling with the muffled conversations of doctors and nurses moving between patients. They stopped at a small hospital room where a woman lay motionless on the bed. Her dark hair was fanned out on the pillow, her skin pale, her lips slightly parted as she breathed shallowly. Tubes ran from her arm, connected to an IV drip, and the faintest trace of dark circles shadowed her closed eyes. Sophie let go of Leo's hand and ran straight to the bedside. She placed her rabbit beside her mother's arm, as if that alone could bring her back. Leo stepped inside, his breath catching in his throat as he got a better look at the woman's face. Recognition hit him like a tidal wave. Emily. His mind reeled backward, pulling him into memories he had buried years ago. He remembered her. The soft laughter, the sharp wit, the way she used to challenge him in ways no one else ever dared to. He remembered the summer they spent together, the way she had looked at him like he was more than just the ruthless businessman the world saw. He remembered the fight, the heated argument that had ended everything. He remembered walking away. And now, she was lying in a hospital bed, barely holding on. Leo exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. His body tensed with the realization that made his pulse hammer against his ribs. Sophie wasn't just any child. She was his child. The blue eyes. The dark curls. The way she had unknowingly drawn him in, her presence pulling at something deep in his core. It all made sense now, but the weight of it was suffocating. Emily had never told him. She had kept this from him for 6 years. His hands curled into fists at his sides as he stared at the fragile woman in the bed, the mother of his child, the child he hadn't even known existed. Sophie turned to him then, her expression unreadable. "Did you know my mom before?" she asked softly. Leo's throat felt tight, the words catching before he could speak them. "Yes," he admitted, his voice quieter than he had expected. Sophie studied him for a long moment. Then she did something that completely shattered him. She reached out and took his hand in hers. It was small, warm, trusting. Leo swallowed hard, squeezing her fingers gently in return. He had spent years believing he was untouchable, that no one could shake him. But in the span of one evening, a little girl with blue eyes had managed to break through every wall he had ever built. And for the first time in his life, he had no idea what came next. Leo sat in the hospital chair, staring at Emily's unconscious face. The weight of the revelation pressed down on him like an anchor, and for the first time in years, he felt completely unprepared for what came next. His life had always been about control, about knowing every move before it happened, about being the one who dictated outcomes. But this was something he hadn't seen coming. Sophie sat beside him, still holding his hand, her small fingers curled around his much larger ones. She had no idea what he had just realized, no idea that the man she had randomly approached for help at the pool wasn't just a stranger. He was her father. Leo tried to process it, tried to wrap his mind around the fact that he had a daughter, that for 6 years, a piece of him had existed in the world without his knowledge. And Emily, she had kept this from him. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay calm. He couldn't demand answers from an unconscious woman, and he couldn't take out his frustration in front of Sophie. The little girl had already been through enough. "Does your mom talk about your dad?" he asked, keeping his voice as steady as possible. Sophie looked up at him with those striking blue eyes that now felt like a mirror of his own. She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the rabbit in her lap. "No," she said quietly. "I used to ask when I was little, but she always changed the subject." Leo's chest ached at that. Had Emily resented him so much that she had erased him from their daughter's life completely? Or had she thought she was protecting Sophie from something? From him? He forced himself to take a slow breath. Getting angry wouldn't help anything. The only thing that mattered now was making sure Emily recovered, and making sure Sophie didn't feel alone in the process. "You said you used to ask," he said, watching her carefully. "Do you still wonder?" Sophie nodded, hugging the rabbit tighter. "Sometimes," she admitted. I used to make up stories about him. That maybe he was a pilot or a secret agent. That he had to go away on a mission but one day he'd come back. Leo felt something inside him crack. He had spent his entire life thinking he was too selfish, too ruthless, too focused on his ambitions to ever be a father. And yet, here was this little girl, his little girl, who had spent years hoping for a man she had never even met. Before he could respond, a soft groan came from the hospital bed. Sophie immediately turned, her face lighting up with relief. "Mom," she gasped, scrambling closer. Leo stood slowly, his body tensing as Emily's eyelids fluttered. She looked exhausted, her skin still pale, her movements sluggish as she tried to lift her head. Her eyes landed on Sophie first. She gave a weak smile and reached out, brushing her fingers over her daughter's cheek. "Hey, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Sophie let out a breath that sounded dangerously close to a sob. "I was so scared, Mommy." Emily's eyes softened, and she glanced around, as if only now realizing where she was. Then, her gaze moved past Sophie and landed on Leo. The second their eyes met, everything in the room shifted. A flicker of shock passed through her expression before something more complicated settled there. She blinked, as if convincing herself she wasn't seeing things, and then her body stiffened. Leo felt the tension instantly, but he didn't move. He just held her gaze, waiting for her to say something. Emily swallowed, her voice barely above a whisper. What are you doing here?" Leo crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. "Sophie found me," he said simply. "She asked me for help." Emily's eyes widened slightly, then flickered to Sophie, who was still clinging to the rabbit. She went to you." Emily's voice trembled slightly, and Leo didn't miss the unspoken meaning behind her words. Sophie had gone to him. Out of all the people in that hotel, she had chosen him. Emily's face paled even more as she seemed to realize something. Her lips parted slightly, and her fingers gripped the blanket covering her. Leo gave her a long, steady look before finally speaking the words that had been burning inside him since he first saw Sophie's eyes. "I know," he said quietly. "I know she's mine." Emily's breath hitched, her entire body going still. Silence filled the hospital room, heavy and suffocating. Leo had spent his entire life making powerful men uncomfortable, forcing them into corners with nothing but his presence. But this wasn't a negotiation or a business deal. This was something far more personal. And for the first time in his life, he didn't know if he had the upper hand. Emily lay frozen in the hospital bed, her breathing shallow as Leo's words settled in the air between them. Her fingers gripped the blanket tightly, as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. The beeping of the monitors filled the silence, but all Leo could focus on was the way her expression shifted, shock, hesitation, something close to fear. She had known this moment would come. That much was obvious. He could see it in her eyes, in the way she swallowed hard, trying to find the right words. But there was no denying it now. Leo had spent his life in control of every situation, but for once, he had no idea what Emily would say next. Sophie sat beside her mother, watching the exchange carefully. She might have been young, but she was smart. Leo could tell she felt the weight of whatever was happening between them. Her small fingers clutched her stuffed rabbit as she shifted her gaze between them, confusion flickering across her face. Finally, Emily exhaled shakily, her voice barely above a whisper. "How did you find out?" Leo narrowed his eyes slightly. "She has my eyes," he said simply. "The second I saw her, I knew something was off. But I didn't confirm it until I ran a DNA test." Emily flinched at that, her body tensing. "You did a test?" Leo didn't look away. "You didn't give me a choice." Her lips parted slightly, but she had no argument. They both knew she had kept the truth from him, and now there was no undoing it. A long silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken emotions. Leo could feel the frustration building inside him, the questions he had been trying to push back now demanding answers. "Why didn't you tell me?" he finally asked, his voice low, controlled. Emily looked away, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her hospital gown. "Because you made it clear you didn't want a family," she said quietly. "When I told you I was pregnant all those years ago, you acted like it was impossible, like it couldn't be real. You walked away, Leo." His jaw tightened. He remembered that night too well. They had fought, the argument escalating to the point of no return. He had been so consumed with his career, with his ambition, that the idea of a child had seemed like a disruption, something he hadn't planned for, something he hadn't wanted to believe. But that was 6 years ago. And now, everything was different. "You should have given me the chance to step up," he said, his voice sharp but not unkind. "You don't get to decide that for me." Emily let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "And what would you have done, Leo? Back then? You were so focused on your business, on proving yourself to the world. Do you really think you would have dropped everything to be a father?" Leo didn't answer right away. Because, deep down, he knew she was right. The man he had been back then wouldn't have been ready. He had been too cold, too selfish. But he wasn't that man anymore. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice softer this time. "But you never gave me the chance to try." Emily looked at him then, her expression unreadable. There was hurt in her eyes, but there was something else, too, something almost hesitant, as if she wasn't sure whether to believe him. Sophie shifted beside her mother, still hugging her rabbit. "Mommy?" she asked quietly, her voice cutting through the tension. Emily immediately softened, reaching out to tuck a curl behind her daughter's ear. "Yes, sweetheart." Sophie looked between them, then at Leo. "Is he my daddy?" The question was so direct, so innocent, that it hit Leo harder than he expected. He had spent years believing he wasn't built for family, that fatherhood wasn't something that fit into his life. But now, staring into the eyes of the little girl who had unknowingly changed everything, he realized how wrong he had been. Emily hesitated, her fingers brushing against Sophie's as she sighed. Then, finally, she nodded. "Yes, baby," she said softly. "He's your dad." Sophie blinked, as if trying to process the words. Then she looked at Leo again, her expression thoughtful. "Are you gonna stay?" she asked. Leo felt something shift inside him, something unfamiliar but undeniable. He had spent years chasing success, power, control. But in that moment, none of it mattered. There was only one answer he could give. "Yes," he said firmly. "I'm not going anywhere." Emily's eyes flickered with something unreadable, but she didn't argue. She just looked down at Sophie, stroking her hair gently. Leo didn't know what the future looked like, but one thing was clear. For the first time in his life, he had something, someone worth fighting for. And he wasn't going to walk away again. Leo had always been a man who made decisions quickly and decisively. In business, there was no room for hesitation. He thrived on control, on knowing the next move before anyone else did. But as he sat in the hospital room, watching Emily's hesitant expression and the way Sophie looked at him with cautious curiosity, he realized this was the one situation where control didn't belong to him. Sophie had just learned the truth, and now she sat on the edge of the hospital bed, her small fingers tracing the seams of her stuffed rabbit. She didn't seem upset, just thoughtful, as if she were processing what it meant to have a father she had never known before. Emily, however, looked anything but calm. She was sitting up now, her back against the pillow, her fingers nervously fidgeting with the blanket draped over her legs. She kept glancing at Leo, and he could see the storm of emotions behind her eyes, uncertainty, guilt, maybe even regret. "You say you're staying," she finally said, her voice quieter than before. "But what does that even mean, Leo? You can't just walk in and expect everything to be fine." Leo met her gaze evenly. "I don't expect that," he said. "But I'm not leaving, either." Emily let out a soft, humorless laugh. "And what? You think you can just become her dad overnight?" Leo exhaled, forcing himself to remain calm. He understood why she was defensive. He had been absent from Sophie's life for 6 years, not by choice, but because of choices Emily had made for him. Now, he was here, and he wasn't going to let anyone, not even Emily, push him away. "I don't expect Sophie to trust me right away," he said, keeping his voice steady. "I don't expect you to either. But I'm not going to disappear just because this is complicated." Emily studied him for a long moment, as if trying to gauge whether he truly meant what he was saying. Sophie looked between them, then tilted her head slightly. "What happens now?" she asked. It was such a simple question, but neither of them had an easy answer. Leo leaned forward slightly, keeping his gaze on his daughter. "Now, we take things one step at a time," he said. "I get to know you. You get to know me. And we figure it out together." Sophie considered this, then looked up at her mother. "Is that okay, Mommy?" Emily hesitated before letting out a slow sigh. "If that's what you want, sweetheart," she said softly. Sophie nodded once, then looked back at Leo with an expression that was difficult to read. "Are you rich?" she asked suddenly. Leo blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected shift in conversation. Emily let out a surprised laugh, shaking her head. "Sophie," she said, amused despite the tension in the room. "What?" Sophie shrugged. "I just want to know." Leo smirked slightly. "Yeah," he admitted. "I am." Sophie considered this for a second, then nodded. "Okay." Emily rubbed a hand over her face. "That's it? That's your big question?" Sophie looked at her mother seriously. "If he's my dad, I need to know if he's good at stuff." Leo chuckled, unable to help himself. "I'd like to think I'm good at some things." Sophie seemed satisfied with that, then went back to hugging her rabbit. Emily sighed again, but this time it wasn't frustration, it was exhaustion. She leaned back against the pillow, closing her eyes for a moment. "I can't believe this is happening," she muttered. Leo studied her carefully. She looked pale, weaker than he liked. He didn't know how much she had been struggling before tonight, but he had a feeling it was more than she let on. "You should rest," he said. "I'll stay with Sophie." Emily opened her eyes, immediately looking wary. "Leo." He shook his head. "I'm not going to take her anywhere. I just want to be here." Emily stared at him for a moment, then finally, reluctantly, nodded. Sophie crawled up beside her mother, still holding her rabbit, and rested her head against Emily's arm. Within minutes, she was asleep. Leo sat back in the chair, watching them quietly. For the first time in his life, he wasn't thinking about business or deals or power. He was thinking about them. And for the first time, he realized just how much he had to lose. Leo didn't leave the hospital that night. He stayed in the uncomfortable chair beside Emily's bed, watching as Sophie curled up next to her mother, her small hand still gripping the stuffed rabbit. Every now and then, Emily would stir, shifting slightly, but she never pushed Sophie away. The room was quiet, the only sounds coming from the steady beeping of the monitors and the occasional footsteps of nurses passing by in the hallway. Leo wasn't used to this kind of stillness. His world was made up of ringing phones, urgent emails, high-stakes meetings, and constant motion. But here, in this small hospital room, everything felt different. Slower. More real. He found himself studying Emily, the way her face softened in sleep, the way the lines of exhaustion on her forehead seemed deeper than they should have been. How long had she been carrying everything on her own? How many nights had she stayed awake, worrying about money, about Sophie, about how to give her daughter the life she deserved? The realization hit him with more force than he expected. While he had spent the last 6 years consumed by work, by profits and power, Emily had been raising their daughter alone. And she hadn't once come to him for help. Not for money. Not for support. Nothing. That truth didn't sit well with him. As the first hints of morning light began filtering through the blinds, Sophie stirred, her small body stretching before her blue eyes blinked open. She looked around, momentarily confused, before she spotted Leo sitting across from her. For a second, she just watched him, as if trying to decide whether or not he was really still there. Then, she sat up slightly and rubbed her eyes. "You stayed," she said, her voice still thick with sleep. Leo nodded. "I told you I would." She didn't say anything right away, just hugged her rabbit a little closer before looking at her mother, who was still asleep. Then, to Leo's surprise, she slid off the bed and walked over to him, standing just a few inches away. "Are you really my dad?" she asked, her voice quieter now. Leo looked down at her, at the dark curls that framed her face, at the striking blue eyes that mirrored his own. It was still strange, still something he was trying to process, but the answer was the easiest thing in the world. "Yes," he said. "I am." Sophie studied him for a long moment, as if trying to decide if she believed him. Then, without warning, she reached out and touched the sleeve of his suit jacket, her small fingers brushing against the fabric. "You feel real," she said. Leo let out a quiet laugh, though there was something tight in his chest. "I am real," he promised. Sophie considered that, then nodded. "Okay." And just like that, it was as if something shifted between them. She didn't ask him any more questions, didn't press him for explanations he wasn't sure he even had yet. Instead, she simply climbed into the chair beside him, curling up with her rabbit in her lap. Leo sat there, staring at her, still trying to wrap his mind around the fact that this little girl was his daughter. He had spent so many years thinking he wasn't made for family, that he wasn't the kind of man who could ever be a father. But here she was. And for some reason, she didn't seem afraid of him. She trusted him. Emily stirred then, her eyelashes fluttering as she woke. The moment she opened her eyes, her gaze went straight to Sophie. A flicker of panic crossed her face for half a second before she realized her daughter was safe, sitting beside Leo. Her expression shifted into something more guarded. "You're still here." Leo met her gaze, unbothered by the skepticism in her voice. "I told you I'm not going anywhere." Emily sighed, running a hand through her hair. She still looked tired, but there was something else there now, something hesitant. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted, her voice quiet. "I don't know how to let you be a part of her life." Leo leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. "Then we figure it out," he said. "Together." Emily looked away for a moment, her fingers tracing the edge of the hospital blanket. "She doesn't even know you," she said. "She's only just met you." Leo nodded. "I know. But she came to me first, Emily. She trusted me before she even knew who I was. That has to mean something." Emily let out a slow breath, her shoulders slumping slightly. "I kept her from you," she admitted. "And I don't regret that, because back then, I didn't think you wanted to be a father. But now," she trailed off, her gaze flickering toward Sophie. Leo could see the struggle on her face, the fear of letting him in, the fear of what it might mean for Sophie. But he also saw something else, reluctant hope. He had spent years building walls around himself, convincing himself that relationships were distractions, that love was a weakness. But as he sat in that hospital room, watching his daughter quietly trust him in a way he didn't deserve, he realized that maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong all along. And for the first time in his life, Leo Kingston wanted something more than just success. He wanted to be a father. The morning sunlight cast a soft glow through the hospital room's window, illuminating the quiet scene inside. Emily sat upright in the hospital bed, her fingers absent-mindedly smoothing over the blanket as she watched Sophie, who was still curled up beside Leo in the chair. The little girl had fallen back asleep, her stuffed rabbit clutched tightly in her arms. Leo hadn't moved. He simply sat there, his posture relaxed, but his mind was anything but. His entire world had shifted in a matter of hours, and now he was left with a reality he had never even considered before. He had a daughter. A 6-year-old child who had spent her life believing her father was nothing more than a distant question, a mystery her mother never answered. Emily exhaled, drawing his attention back to her. He could see the hesitation in her expression, the uncertainty that hadn't left since she first realized he knew the truth. He understood it. She had raised Sophie alone, made every decision for her, and now, without warning, she had to figure out how to make space for him in a life he should have been part of all along. "I don't know how this is going to work," Emily admitted, her voice quiet, careful. "She's never had a father, Leo. She's never even asked for one since she was little." Leo studied her for a long moment before answering. "That doesn't mean she doesn't need one." Emily flinched slightly, as if his words struck something inside her, but she didn't argue. She glanced at Sophie, her face softening as she reached out to brush a stray curl away from her daughter's cheek. "I'm scared," she confessed. "Not just for her, but for me too." Leo leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees. "I get that," he said, his voice calmer than he felt. "But I need you to understand something, Emily. I'm not walking away from this. I missed 6 years of her life. I'm not missing another second." Emily looked at him then, really looked at him, as if searching for cracks in his determination. But there were none. He wasn't saying it just to say it. He meant every single word. After a long silence, she sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Okay," she said finally. "We take this slow. We figure it out as we go." Leo nodded, relief washing over him. "That's all I'm asking." Emily's lips pressed together, and she exhaled again, as if forcing herself to release years of fear and doubt. "She likes chocolate chip pancakes," she said after a moment. "It's the only breakfast she'll eat without complaining." Leo's eyebrows lifted slightly at the sudden change in conversation, but then he realized what she was doing. She was giving him something small, but important. A glimpse into their daughter's life. "Chocolate chip pancakes," he repeated, committing it to memory. Emily hesitated again, then continued. "She hates the sound of thunder. She always sleeps with that rabbit, even though it's old and falling apart. She loves coloring, but only with markers because she thinks crayons break too easily. And she hums when she concentrates, even though she doesn't realize she's doing it." Leo's chest tightened as he listened. Each detail felt like a window into the life he had missed, a life he should have been part of. "She's going to have questions," Emily said, her voice softer now. "She's going to want to know why you weren't there before." Leo's jaw tensed, because that was the one question he wasn't sure how to answer. How did he explain to a 6-year-old that he had been too blind to see the truth? That he had walked away from something he hadn't even known was real? "I'll tell her the truth," he said finally. "That I didn't know. That if I had, I never would have left." Emily held his gaze, searching for any sign of dishonesty. But there was none. After a long pause, she nodded. "Okay." Leo sat back, feeling something settle inside him. He had no idea what the future held, no idea how long it would take for Sophie to truly see him as her father. But he would wait. He would prove himself every single day, not just to her, but to Emily as well. Because for the first time in his life, he had something worth fighting for. And he wasn't going to lose it. This story is about more than just a billionaire discovering he has a daughter. It's about redemption, responsibility, and the unexpected ways life forces us to face the choices we once ran from. Leo Kingston starts as a man who believes he controls everything, his business, his reputation, his emotions. But finding Sophie shatters that illusion. She represents something he never accounted for, the chance to be part of something bigger than himself. The moment he realizes she's his daughter, his entire world shifts. Power and wealth no longer define him, fatherhood does. Emily, too, is a complex character. She's not just a woman who kept a secret, she's someone who made a difficult decision based on who Leo was at the time. She protected her daughter the only way she knew how. Her hesitance to let him in isn't just about anger, it's about fear. She's afraid of what letting him into Sophie's life might mean, afraid that he'll leave, that he'll break Sophie's heart the way he once broke hers. But the true heart of this story is Sophie. She's the one who instinctively reaches out to Leo before she even knows who he is. She is trusting, resilient, and full of innocent hope. And in the end, she's the reason both Leo and Emily take a chance on something uncertain. The final moments of the story aren't about a perfect, happy ending. Instead, they show the beginning of something real. Leo can't erase the past, but he can change the future. Emily can't undo her choices, but she can allow herself to believe that people can change. And Sophie, she gets what she's always quietly longed for, a father who chooses her. The beauty of this story lies in its imperfection. It's about learning to build something new from the wreckage of past mistakes. It's about forgiveness, second chances, and the realization that sometimes, the most unexpected people can change our lives forever.